Such a nice car for a black woman to be driving." Officer Cole let out a hard laugh and slammed his baton on the hood, stopping Marsha cold. He leaned into the trunk and threw her a vicious look. "Here it is, the evidence of a stolen car. You are finished." But only a few seconds later, the tables shifted. A small detail in the evidence left the entire patrol unit pale, something Cole never expected to expose him. And then Marsha's real identity emerged, an identity powerful enough to end both officers' careers that very night. If you were Marsha, would you stay silent under humiliation or stand up to someone who abused power? And if you were Cole, would you dare face the evidence that condemned you? Follow this series, hit subscribe, and share your thoughts because justice lives only when we speak up. Marsha Wilson left the base after 3 days of leave, the night sky wrapped in a deep violet shade, the road quiet as if the entire city had fallen asleep. She drove slowly, the fatigue easing as the night air slipped through the window. Everything should have ended gently, like a soft exhale after a long journey. But from behind her, red and blue lights spun hard into the mirror. She blinked as unease crept up her spine. The patrol car surged closer, its order to pull over sharp and forceful. Marsha steered to the shoulder, turned off the engine, and placed her 2 hands on the wheel, the safety routine she had learned through many years on duty. Cole approached the front of the car with a detached stride, his stare fixed on her as if he had already formed a judgment before speaking. He stopped at her door, hand resting on his belt, his clipped voice slipping through the lowered window. "Step out of the car, now." It was not an official command, not a reason, only the bare pressure of someone used to holding power. Marsha felt tension spike to its peak through those 3 short words. She stepped out in silence, keeping every movement slow because she knew even a quick shift could be twisted into a threat. Hayes walked up right after, his eyes scanning her from head to toe, then drifting to the car as if weighing a ready accusation. He let out a thin, stretched laugh. "People like you do not usually drive something like this unless you stole it." Each word dropped into the night like poison falling into cold air. Marsha kept her gaze steady, her mind calm, though her palms tightened on instinct. She had heard many forms of contempt, but the disdain curling at Hayes's mouth made the air heavier. Cole held out his hand, his voice flat. "Papers." Marsha took the folder from the glove box and handed it over, but Cole only glanced and flicked it aside as if touching trash. "Anyone can print papers like these." The words cut like a blade against the patience of anyone being insulted in the middle of the road, yet she stayed composed. She knew even a raised brow could be labeled defiance. She drew in a slow breath and kept her tone clear but soft. "I have fully cooperated. What is your reason for stopping me?" A simple question, yet the air paused for a beat. Instead of answering, Cole turned to Hayes with a quiet laugh, the sort that came when someone believed they held complete control. Both ignored her question, and that told Marsha everything. This was not a procedure, it was prejudice. Cole stepped closer, his stare heavy with pressure. "When did you buy this car?" It was irrelevant, but full of insinuation. Hayes followed, his voice nudging toward provocation. "Or who gave it to you?" Every word carried the same message, that a black woman could not possibly own the car she was driving. The night wind brushed Marsha's cheek, carrying the smell of dust, trouble, and danger. Her years of field experience told her the rhythm of this situation was wrong, not because of their hardness, but because of the way they looked at her as someone already judged before they even knew her name. From the way they stood, from their silent exchange of glances, from Cole's crooked smile, she understood this stop was not a simple administrative check. It was driven by bias, by a twisted certainty that they could do whatever they wanted and say whatever they pleased as long as the person in front of them had no way to fight back. Marsha kept her hands at her sides, her gaze steady, her voice low but firm. "I have given you my papers and I have cooperated. What more do you need?" This time, the question was not meant to seek an explanation. It was her way of gauging whether these two men still had any boundary left. Cole stared at her for a beat too long, enough to reveal his irritation at a question that pointed straight at his responsibility. His dismissive attitude did not surprise her, but it confirmed she was facing two people who had no intention of doing right, only of proving their authority over her. The patrol lights kept flashing across the pavement, reflecting cold streaks on the paint of Marsha's car. A few other vehicles slowed as they passed, then slipped away, leaving behind a hollow pocket of air. In that stillness, Marsha felt danger threading through each breath, not because she was afraid, but because she understood that the loss of control from these officers could open the door to something much worse if she made even one mistake. Every movement they made triggered her warrior instinct, but also forced her to stay absolutely focused. She looked at Cole, a look that said she would not be shaken by insults. It seemed to bother him, as if her calm made his power less effective. He stepped closer, his shadow stretching across the pavement, his voice low and threatening. "You will cooperate the way we want, not the way you want." Marsha kept her gaze steady, though her mind was already shifting. This stop was only beginning, and she knew things would escalate. The night sky stayed silent, but under the pulsing lights, the space between the three of them tightened like a string ready to snap. Marsha stood tall, her breath even though her mind was prepared for the worst, and she knew the first few minutes were only a warning of the chain of events Cole and Hayes were ready to force onto her in any way they could. This night would not end peacefully, and the insults that started it all were only the spark for a much larger fire waiting to ignite. The patrol lights kept flashing across the pavement, casting sharp streaks on Marsha's car as if inspecting her presence in the night. Cole stood a few steps away, his eyes moving from the vehicle to her face with an open scrutiny. He curled his lip, the crooked smile showing contempt rather than amusement, then dropped a line as heavy as a stone falling into air already thick with tension. "A black woman driving a luxury car. Who do you think will believe that?" The words rang cold and cutting, stripping away the basic respect a police officer should uphold. Marsha felt her palms tighten in a reflex born from insult, yet her gaze stayed calm, her expression revealing nothing but her steady resolve. Hayes stepped closer, as if trying to press her further into a corner. His eyes swept her from top to bottom, before he asked in a stretched voice laced with venomous sarcasm, "What do you do for work? Or is it the kind of work I think it is?" Every word he spoke carried a baseless accusation wrapped in mockery, making the insult even more blatant. Marsha did not need training to understand his intent, and though irritation rose like a low current inside her, she kept her posture straight and her gaze steady. Years of discipline had taught her that calm was the strongest weapon in moments like this. Cole snatched the papers from Hayes, flipped through a few pages as if examining them, then suddenly let out a quiet scoff. "Your name looks better on a watch list than on a title." He flicked the edge of the papers, a small gesture that showed clear disdain. His words did more than imply suspicion. They revealed a bias so deep it dismissed her identity outright. Registration, ownership documents, and personal identification were all seen through the eyes of someone convinced that anything contradicting his assumptions had to be fake. In that moment, Marsha felt the invisible walls closing in, turning the situation into one where no amount of proof could break through their prejudice. She drew a breath and chose to answer with controlled calm, though her tone held firm edges. "I expect you to stay professional." Her voice was neither loud nor icy, yet it carried weight. It reminded them she understood her rights and obligations, that she saw clearly their behavior did not belong to a routine stop, but instead of stepping back or adjusting their attitude, attitude, Cole and Hayes burst into laughter, the mocking sound cutting through the still air like a needle against her dignity. The laughter was not just a reaction. It was a declaration that her reminder held no value to them. Cole gave her a cold stare, long enough to make clear he saw her not as someone protected by the law, but as someone he could toy with at will. Hayes folded his arms, smirking, his eyes filled with the toxic satisfaction of pushing her into a lower place. The night wind blew a few papers from Cole's hand and sent them skimming across the pavement, yet he made no move to pick them up, as if stressing that Marsha's legitimate documents meant nothing compared to the prejudice he projected onto her. Marsha bent down to gather them, a small act that showed her sense of dignity had not wavered, even while she was being pushed into a vulnerable position. That moment made her realize the danger did not lie in their words, but in their attitude. They needed no reason and cared nothing for evidence. All they needed was to see someone like her beside a car like that, and it was enough to decide the outcome. With no goodwill and no clear procedure, everything had already slipped into a dark space where bias wrote a person's fate before truth had any chance to surface. Marsha's eyes settled on Cole's face, where arrogance had grown increasingly bold. She understood that any strong reaction could be twisted against her, so she kept her calm, the way a soldier is trained not to lose judgment under provocation. Her silence was not surrender, but a strategic choice, because she knew the night was entering dangerous territory and every move had to be deliberate. The two officers exchanged a look heavy with the belief that they had full control. The space around them tightened, the patrol lights still blinking in a steady rhythm, yet forming what felt like a wall of light, trapping Marsha inside an unseen hold. The echo of their laughter lingered in her mind, blending with the monotone night and deepening the sense of suffocation. Their insults were not new to her, but in this moment they became a warning that the night would soon grow far worse. Marsha stood straight, hands at her sides, her gaze calm, though her vigilance had reached its highest point. She knew things were slipping out of the ordinary and would soon escalate as these officers continued to act on their instinct for abuse rather than their duty. And in that brief instant, she understood fully that the confrontation had only begun, and their insults were merely the opening steps of a battle she would have to face to the end. The moment Cole and Hayes' mocking laughter faded, the air around Marsha thickened like murky water. The red and blue patrol lights kept slicing across the pavement, making every movement from the officers stand out sharper and more tense. Cole walked toward her car with an arrogant stride, yanking the door open so hard the hinge let out a long metallic screech, like steel forced past its limit. "Do not touch anything. I will find what I need," he barked over his shoulder, his tone claiming absolute control without a single explanation. Marsha stood outside, watching his every motion, recognizing the familiar pattern of conduct cross the line, yet her gaze stayed calm. Hayes was no different. He circled to the other side, opened the back door, and reached in as if tearing through a storage bin. His hand grabbed Marsha's bag, pulled it out, then threw it onto the pavement with enough force that the zipper scraped the ground in a sharp sound. "This looks more like something a scammer carries than an educated woman," he said, as if he understood her life when all he saw was what his bias dictated. The bag hit the ground, spilling a few items like a parking pass and a notebook around his boots. Hayes glanced down at them with mocking intent, while Marsha bent to gather each item, her movements slow and controlled, a quiet act of self-possession in the face of blatant humiliation. Cole leaned deep into the car, flipping through every item and compartment as if hunting for proof of a crime he had already decided existed. His metal flashlight struck the seat, its beam sweeping across the interior and bouncing off the rearview mirror in blinding streaks. After a while, finding nothing he could use against her, Cole stepped back, inhaled, then suddenly kicked the side of the car, the heavy thud echoing through the night. "Nice car. Bet the real owner misses it," he said with smug satisfaction, as if the kick itself was a display of his power. The act had nothing to do with evidence. It was meant to remind Marsha that, in his mind, he could do anything he wanted. Marsha felt the vibration of the kick pulse through the metal, spreading into the air like an invisible cut. Anger ran through her, a heat both restrained by military discipline and fed by the constant insults of the night. She stood tall, shoulders squared, eyes steady on Cole. Her breath stayed even as she lowered her voice, each word precise. "You are damaging lawful property." The statement did not land like a loud protest, but like a firm declaration that hardened the atmosphere in an instant. Cole turned his head, his eyes narrowing, a flicker of surprise crossing his expression as if he had not expected her to speak. But the moment passed, and he laughed, a sound like gravel scraping metal, rough and dismissive. Hayes joined in, an empty echo rising in the dark and forming a wall of noise that swallowed Marsha's words between two streams of abused authority. They did not let her reminder sway them. Instead, it pushed them to prove even harder that her voice held no weight in their eyes. Marsha bent to pick up the parking pass tossed onto the ground, her gaze quietly tracking their movements around her car. The harsh motions, the angry door swings, the kicks and hits all made one truth clear. They were not searching for facts. They were searching for an excuse. She stood, keeping close enough to watch but far enough to avoid being accused of interfering. Every act they took exposed their bias in plain sight, and for that reason, she had to stay calm and witness every violation they committed. The night wind rustled through the roadside trees, their leaves whispering against the sounds of Cole and Hayes rummaging. No cars passed in that moment, shrinking the road into a private stage. Marsha stood at the center of a scene she had never chosen, pushed into it like an unwilling character. The insults had been layered until they wrapped her in an invisible net, and she sensed everything sliding toward a danger far beyond mere words. Hayes picked up a small item from the passenger seat and held it to eye level, shaking it as if to mock her further. But Marsha met his stare without revealing a hint of emotion. Her calm irritated him, as if he needed pushback to validate his authority. Cole continued opening compartments, slamming one so hard the panel struck the frame with a heavy crack. He scanned it briefly, then snapped it shut with no regard for damage. His movements were reckless by choice, each one meant to weaken her position so any future accusation could be framed as justified. Under the flashing lights, the scene unfolded like a slow-motion reel in which two men with power dug their own pit of injustice through every action. Marsha stood alert, her restraint stretched tight. She knew the stop would not end with a rough search. Cole and Hayes had shown their intent clearly, and every strike against her car signaled the direction this night would take. She steadied herself, aware that the hours ahead would test not only her composure, but her ability to protect herself with intellect and resolve. The air on the empty nighttime road had turned into an unpleasant mix of the hot metallic smell from her mistreated car and the suffocating scrutiny of the two officers. Marsha remained where she stood, keeping a safe distance from Cole and Hayes, her eyes fixed on every movement and every shift in their expressions. The tension was no longer a straight, predictable line, but a spiral ready to pull everything toward the worst outcome. While Cole kept searching her car with a forced look of irritation, Hayes stepped closer, his breath carrying the stale scent of old cigarettes and the aggression of someone eager to corner her. Hayes folded his arms, tilted his head, and smirked as though he were appraising an object rather than a person. "Come on, tell me how you make your money, or are you afraid to say it?" he taunted, drawing out each word with a push meant to provoke Marsha into reacting, giving them an excuse to escalate. She looked at him without blinking, her face so calm it visibly irritated him. She did not respond, did not explain, because she knew he did not want an answer. He only wanted ammunition for the outcome he was trying to create. While Hayes worked to hold her attention, Marsha sensed faint movement from behind her, where the flashing lights revealed only fragments of Cole's figure. Cole stepped away from the driver's seat and moved toward the back of the car with footsteps quieter than before, as if he did not want her to track what he was doing. His actions carried the air of someone preparing something malicious, yet taking a twisted pleasure in feeling the plan close to success. He crouched near the trunk, his hand slipping into his jacket to pull out a small object that glinted under the streetlight. Cole cracked the trunk open just slightly, his gaze flicking to Hayes as if confirming that his partner was keeping Marsha occupied. He lowered his voice to a whisper meant only for himself, but her heightened awareness still caught a few words. "Let us see how sweet she talks when evidence shows up." His tone was low, but the sarcasm tightened her chest. Marsha did not immediately turn to look, but she knew something was happening at the trunk, something that had nothing to do with truth or procedure. The night's silence thickened, as if the darkness itself was holding its breath, waiting for what Cole was about to do. Cole reached into the trunk, where the inner lining hid a small compartment meant for loose items. He lifted the fabric and slipped inside the key he had taken from the evidence room. In a single moment, the planted piece of proof sat exactly where he knew it would leave Marsha, with almost no way to defend herself once it was found after the search. His fingers released the key, the faint metallic tap barely audible, yet in Marsha's mind it rang like a warning. Cole pulled his hand back, closed the trunk, and straightened up with a triumphant smile. "Looks like it suits you better now," he said, loud enough for Hayes to hear, but soft enough to signal their quiet collusion. Hayes glanced toward Cole, their eyes meeting for a moment filled with unspoken intent. It was the look of men who had done questionable things before and had grown comfortable supporting each other in steering outcomes their way. Hayes gave a slight approving nod, then turned back to Marsha with the expression of someone convinced he already held victory. "You are not getting out of this one," he said, his tone dropping like a sentence handed down to someone they believed could not fight back. Marsha stood still, watching every smallest movement, and in that moment she understood the trap had been fully assembled. The earlier, rough handling had been the prelude to something worse. This was no longer a random stop. It had become a deliberate setup. Cole and Hayes were not seeking the truth. They were manufacturing it, and that truth was built on power hunger, bias, and the blind confidence that no one would stand up for a black woman on a deserted road at night. Thoughts moved through Marsha's mind like puzzle pieces forming a complete picture. She recalled training on handling situations beyond control, drills on staying steady in danger, and battlefield lessons teaching that silence and observation can sometimes be the sharpest weapons. She could not stop Cole's actions now, but she could prepare to face whatever followed. She knew truth has a way of surfacing, and those acting with malicious intent often make their biggest mistakes when they believe they have already won. The night wind grew stronger, rustling the trees like a quiet warning from nature itself. Marsha stood tall, showing no fear or panic, meeting the moment with the composure of someone who had walked through life or death before. Her calm only agitated Hayes further because he wanted to see her break under the pressure he created. Cole stood next to him, his hand on his hip as if the victory was already his. But Marsha understood one thing clearly. No matter how unfavorable the situation seemed, she still had choices, and the right moment to use them would come. Tonight, they believed they had locked her fate with a planted key, yet they did not know this very act would become their fatal weakness once the truth surfaced. Marsha said nothing more, offered no argument, because she knew fewer words served her best. Everything was moving exactly as they wanted, and she had no reason to alter the game before she held the advantage. ended. A silence settled between the three of them, quiet yet heavy. Cole and Hayes stared at her as if waiting for signs of collapse, but Marsha stood steady, calm, and observant. She knew the trap had just been completed, and from this moment on, the story would shift into an entirely different phase, one in which they would corner themselves inside the very darkness they had built with their own ambition and prejudice. The moment Cole finished planting the key and closed the trunk, the atmosphere shifted. He adjusted his belt, took a deep breath as if preparing to step into a performance he had rehearsed in his head. The flashing patrol lights cast broken streaks across his face, sharpening the slyness in his expression. Cole placed his hand on the trunk lid, lifted it with exaggerated force as though trying to create a dramatic reveal, then bent down to look inside. Every motion was overdone, crafted to build his stage discovery. He let out a loud, deliberate gasp and snapped his head toward Marsha, eyes wide, voice dripping with fake shock. "Well now, the missing key to the car? Care to explain?" Hayes jumped into character instantly, stepping forward with a seriousness far different from his earlier mockery. His face tightened, his voice dropped as he shifted into the tone of someone confronting a dangerous criminal. "Car theft is no small charge here. You know that?" he said, not to inform or warn, but to impose. Each word was pressed down with a sharp stare aimed at shutting down any explanation she might offer. Cole stayed at the trunk, pretending to recheck it to reinforce the story he was building, sloppy in detail but confident in the belief that his badge would cover every lie. Marsha stood a few steps away, her gaze calm as a midnight lake while her mind worked beneath the surface. She knew exactly what came next because their coordination was too obvious, like two actors performing a scene they had practiced dozens of times. Instead of rushing to defend herself or reacting with anger, she let them continue exposing themselves. The sudden discovery of evidence was the next piece of their setup, and what they needed now was her reaction to legitimize their accusation. Cole slammed the trunk shut and marched toward her, closing the distance until she could feel the heat of his breath mixed with the harsh smell of smoked cigarettes. He tilted his head, eyes full of provocation, then growled, "Speak, or wait for the cuffs." The words, cut like a blade aimed at her composure, meant to split through her restraint. He stepped even closer, shoulders pushed forward to intimidate, one hand resting on his holster as if ready to shift force. But Marsha did not move back. The patrol lights washed over her face, shaping soft but steady shadows that highlighted the calm of someone who had survived far worse. She looked directly into Cole's eyes, not avoiding, not shrinking, meeting him with a resolve that made him pause for a brief beat. Her voice rose gently but firm, each word weighted with clarity. "I did not steal anything, and you both know that." That moment cut through the heavy air like a blade. The way Marsha spoke made her denial more than a defense. It was a direct statement aimed at the lie Cole and Hayes were staging. Hayes frowned, his hand tightening at his side. He had not expected her to say that because they wanted fear. They wanted a flare of panic they could use to push things further. But her calm unsettled both of them more than any argument could. Cole let out a thin smile at her response, though it lacked the confidence it had earlier. "Every thief says that," he replied, his tone so practiced it was clear he had delivered the line many times before. He turned to Hayes and shrugged as if he had just confirmed the version of truth he wanted to believe. "She hid the evidence in her own car. Classic behavior of someone who knows they are guilty." Hayes jumped in immediately, nodding hard as if to reinforce his partner's words. "Exactly. People like her always think they are smarter than the law, but here we see right through it." The way he stressed "people like her" carried a meaning all three understood, even without saying it aloud. It was an accusation built not on evidence but on bias. They did not care who Marsha was, what her history or identity held. They only needed one planted detail, even a fabricated one, to craft a narrative that backed them into power. Marsha drew in a slow breath to steady herself. She looked at the two officers, their stern expressions passing judgment based on what they had created rather than anything true. She realized any explanation now would be pointless because they were not seeking the truth. They were acting like men who believed authority allowed them to reshape reality however they wished. What they did not know, what they would understand only by the end of the night, was that these very actions would become evidence against them. She let them continue playing the role of men in control because she knew her moment to shift the story had not arrived yet. Cole stepped to her left, blocking part of her view, leaning in as if trying to study her face from closer range. His voice dropped, sliding into a quieter, more threatening tone. "Your chance to explain is getting small. I suggest you talk before things get worse." Hayes stood behind him with folded arms, wearing the expression of someone who believed they held total command of the situation. Marsha remained standing tall, her eyes steady and unmoved. She knew that once Cole found the planted key, they would build an entire chain of arguments to shape her into the suspect they wanted. She did not answer his threat. Instead, she held her firm gaze, creating a silence that made both men uneasy. Cole interpreted that silence differently. He let out a short laugh, the kind someone gives when they think they have already won. "Silence means you admit it," he said, stepping back with satisfaction. But what he mistook for defeated silence was Marsha's way of keeping control. She refused to give them the reaction they needed, and that unsettled them more than resistance ever could. Marsha understood this was only the opening round of a confrontation that would stretch much further, and she would step into the next part with a level of preparedness neither of these officers expected. The moment Marsha stayed silent instead of fighting the accusation, Cole clenched his jaw, the muscles at his temples twitching as if irritation had filled every corner of his mind when she did not break the way he expected. Her calm did not signal defeat to him. It challenged his ego. He stepped back, glanced at the polished surface of the car, then suddenly swung his baton and slammed it onto the hood. The metallic crack rang sharply across the empty road, echoing like compressed thunder. Cole glared at her, growling through his teeth. "You are resisting. I am allowed to increase force." His breath came in short bursts, his tone with the bitterness of someone trying to turn his own loss of control into justification for violence. Marsha looked at the small dent now visible on the hood, her brows tightening slightly, yet her breathing stayed steady. Cole's strike was not meant to restrain. It was meant to intimidate, to scare her into the trap they were building. She knew any strong reaction could be twisted into evidence of resisting, which was exactly what they wanted. She held her ground, hands loose at her sides, eyes following Cole's every movement without a flicker of fear. Hayes, catching on to Cole's intention, moved in quickly. He stepped so close that the distance between him and Marsha shrank to a few inches. He pressed his hand hard onto her shoulder and arm, pinning her back against the car as if restraining a dangerous suspect. "Move a little more, and you're looking at resisting an officer," he said, his warning coated in a false sweetness that made the moment even more warped. From that close range, Marsha could hear his breathing, fast and excited, as if he was reveling in the power he was exerting over her body. Her back touched the cold paint, the metal still trembling faintly from Cole's blow. Hayes's closeness did not throw her off balance, but it forced her awareness to heighten. She shifted her shoulders slightly for stability, feet planted firmly on the pavement. Hayes waited for any reaction, watching for the smallest motion he could inflate into a charge. But Marsha denied him that satisfaction. She let him lean in without resistance, frustrating him with her refusal to give him a reason to escalate. Cole approached again, his hand resting on the holster at his right hip. The smell of leather, cigarette residue, and road dust from the patrol car drifted through the night, tightening the air around them. He leaned in close enough that she could see the red and blue lights flicker in his eyes like tiny flames. "Want me to prove it?" he said. The question never meant to be answered. It was a threat, a deliberate push toward the edge of lethal force. His fingers did not draw the gun, but they lifted just enough to make anyone without her train in panic on sight. Marsha looked directly into Cole's eyes, feeling his breath and the anger rising inside him. She understood how dangerous this moment was. One wrong move, one reaction at the wrong time. Anything they interpreted as defiance could become an excuse to fire a shot. Her years in the military had taught her exactly how severe a bullet was when pulled under the subjective judgment of its holder. But she also knew that their fear of someone who understood the law, who could stay controlled, who could observe clearly, could make them reckless enough to expose mistakes. She stayed still, but her gaze did not retreat. A breeze moved through her hair, brushing strands across her cheek. Hayes kept his grip, yet his hand trembled slightly under the pressure of the escalating tension. Marsha's calm unsettled both men because they were used to people crumbling under their authority, people who trembled and pleaded when threatened. But she was different, too steady, too composed, and it agitated them. Cole curled his lip, trying to appear confident, but the uncertainty in his eyes betrayed him. He could not understand why the woman before him remained so unwavering. Marsha finally spoke, her voice low but firm, the sound carrying the controlled strength of someone fully aware she had been pushed to the edge of danger. "You are exceeding legal limits." The statement was not loud, not taunting, but sharp enough to cut through the false authority Cole and Hayes were attempting to wear. Her calm made the words fall with the weight of a verdict. Cole blinked once, his expression shifting from smug to tense in an instant. The statement came from someone who knew the law, who knew her rights, and that unsettled him. He did not want to deal with someone who understood the rules because it made manipulation harder. "Limits?" he growled, stepping a fraction closer as if challenging her. "I decide the limits in this situation." He said it as though it were true, but the edge of doubt in his voice weakened the claim. Hayes kept his hand on her, yet his eyes no longer held the confidence they had earlier. The situation was turning into a scene they were no longer fully controlling. She did not fall into fear, did not overreact, did not tremble. That made every layer of their behavior look exposed. They had set a trap and were trying to push her into a mistake, but she remained as solid as stone. The dark night settled over the quiet road, the flashing patrol lights stretching and shrinking their shadows with each passing gust of wind. The moment felt frozen, yet the quickened breaths of Cole and Hayes revealed how sharply the tension had risen. They had tried to push the situation beyond Marsha's control, but in doing, they were losing control themselves. Marsha did not know exactly what would come next, but she knew the confrontation had reached the peak of violence, and a single wrong word or misplaced movement could shift it into a realm where life and death sat only a trigger pull apart. Still, she stood firm, calm, her gaze fixed on the two men trying to crush her under their authority, and that steady, unflinching stance, that refusal to back away or shrink, unsettled them more than they realized. The tension stretched tight, like a wire suddenly paused as Marsha shifted her shoulder, slipping free of Hayes's pressure with a small but deliberate motion. It was not resistance. It was the adjustment she needed to stand firm and face the two men trying to force her into panic. Her eyes locked onto Cole, whose hand still rested on his holster, his face flushed with anger that kept crashing into her unwavering calm. Marsha drew a breath, her voice dropping low but carrying a sharpness that sliced through the heavy air. "If this is evidence, you must seal it immediately, or prove you did not place it there yourselves." Her words rang clearly in the night, untouched by wind or flashing lights. Each syllable was not a taunt, it was a reminder of the procedure they had intentionally ignored. Cole froze for a split second, not out of fear, but because he was rattled that she understood the protocol so well he could not twist it easily. quietly. His eyes narrowed, the lines of his face tightening. "Who do you think you are to give us orders?" he snapped, his voice rising just enough to reveal how shaken he was. He stepped closer, but the way he threw out his words showed he was struggling to steady himself. He had not expected to confront someone who knew the law, and that truth bent the power he thought he controlled through intimidation. Hayes watched Cole, waiting for the next cue, but instead he caught a rare moment of hesitation in his partner. It unsettled him. The swagger he displayed earlier peeled away like cracked paint under the streetlights. Marsha did not back away from the pressure closing in on her. Instead, she slipped her hand into her coat pocket, slow and deliberate, a movement that showed she was not afraid. Hayes jerked instinctively, thinking she was about to do something dangerous, but Marsha simply pulled out her phone. The blue glow from the screen lit her face, now startlingly composed. She dialed a familiar number, lifted the phone to her ear, and spoke with the controlled tone of someone who had nothing left to lose but held every piece of evidence to protect herself. "Officer Grant, I need an on-scene misconduct investigation." Her voice was soft, yet it shattered the fragile illusion of control that Cole and Hayes had built. The phrase "on-scene misconduct" sucked the air out of the night, and the name Grant cracked the situation wide open. Grant was someone they knew, the one who handled the cases officers most wanted buried, someone even patrol units kept their distance from. Hayes snatched his hand away from her shoulder as if burned. "Did you just call IA?" he asked, his voice breaking under the weight of fear. The moment the words left him, his face drained of color, and the flash in red and blue lights painting his features in the blotches of panic. For the first time, real fear, not manufactured intimidation, showed in his eyes. He stepped back half a pace, searching Cole's face for reassurance, but Cole stood frozen, his expression hardening into stone. Cole stared at Marsha as if trying to decode what had just happened. He had not expected her to call IA, and even less expected her to do it with the ease of someone inviting a familiar guest to a party. The skin along his neck flushed red, his eyes widened, and for several seconds he could not form a single word. Marsha stood still, phone in hand, her stance firm, as though she had just placed a chess piece that forced both opponents into a corner. A gust of night wind swept across the road, rolling grains of dust around their feet. The sudden silence stretched the street wider, longer, exposing the gap between what they believed they had the power to do and the reality they were now about to face. Cole finally found his voice, but instead of the shouting he used earlier, he managed only a few hoarse, clipped words. "She is lying." Yet, even as he said it, he knew the claim was useless, because the one trembling was not Marsha, it was Hayes. Unease spilled from Cole, his tricks and experience no longer giving him the confidence they once did. Marsha lowered her phone, her eyes never leaving the two men. She did not need to speak further. That call alone had already triggered a shift they could not reverse. Hayes wiped sweat from his forehead, and though the night was cool, he glanced down the long, dark road as if hoping the situation might disappear if he simply avoided looking at it. Cole, once aggressive and dominant, now tried to mask his rising panic with a rigid expression, but the small twitch at the corner of his mouth betrayed him. Marsha stood relaxed now, her shoulders free, no longer pinned to the car, no longer threatened by a baton or hostile stares. She stayed silent, knowing that from this moment on, every word they spoke could be documented by IA for the official investigation. This was no longer a random traffic stop. It had become a case with enough merit to trigger a formal review, and Cole and Hayes, men who believed they could control the narrative with force and deceit, were being dragged toward a dead end by their own arrogance. The street lights spilled their glow across the surface of Marsha's car, where the dent from Cole's baton and Hayes's fingerprints still marked the metal. Their acts of aggression sat in plain sight, and with her composed, unflinching presence, Marsha had taken the first step toward their downfall. She knew the first shift in power that night had succeeded, and the path to truth had begun the moment she decided to make that call to IA. The patrol car's flashing lights still flickered, when the IA vehicle rolled into the pool of brightness at the far end of the road. Their arrival cut through the night like a blade, splitting the suffocating tension around Cole and Hayes into two stark halves. Marsha stood still, her hands relaxed at her sides, her eyes following every step the IA team took as they approached. The light reflecting off their uniforms carried a kind of authority the two officers before her lacked entirely. Leading them was Officer Reyes, tall, firm-voiced. He walked forward, his gaze sweeping over the scene before locking directly onto Cole, as though identifying the anomaly in the dark. Reyes did not smile, did not exchange pleasantries. He spoke the moment he stood close enough. "Hand over the evidence, now." His voice was steady and strong, a command that allowed no delay. Cole's shoulder twitched, a small reaction, but enough for Marsha to see the hesitation he struggled to hide. His eyes darted to Hayes, then to Marsha, as if searching for an excuse or a way to stall. But Reyes stepped forward again, the red and blue glow sharpening the edges of his expression as he repeated, heavier, "You heard me. Hand it over." Cole swallowed, pressed his lips together, then reluctantly turned to open Marsha's trunk. He lifted out the evidence bag he had just prepared, trying to mask his unease with quick, stiff movements, but his hand trembled slightly, and Reyes's sharp gaze did not miss it. Reyes accepted the bag with two gloved fingers, examined every line of the seal, then placed it into the secured IA container. The precision of his actions made Hayes step back half a pace, lowering his eyes as though realizing every trick they had pulled was now under a blinding spotlight. Reyes activated the plate scanner on the hood of the IA vehicle, entered the verification code, and aimed it at Marsha's license plate. The screen lit up, displaying results instantly. The glow washed over Hayes's paling face, making him look as if he had just heard his own sentence read aloud. One clear line appeared. LT, Marsha Wilson, U.S. Navy. Silence fell hard over the scene. Hayes sucked in a shaky breath, his lips parting without sound. After a few ragged breaths, he turned to Cole, his face ashen, voice rough. "We are done, Cole." Cole pressed his lips so tightly the edges blanched. He tried to hold a neutral expression, but his hand clenched at his hip, knuckles standing out beneath the skin. He said nothing, yet his eyes admitted what his mouth could not. The person they had treated as a suspect, the woman they had framed all night, was an active naval officer, a status any trained cop knew required caution and respect. Worse still, they had pushed the situation straight into a formal investigation through their own blind arrogance. Reyes typed a quick note into his electronic pad, then handed the evidence bag to a technician waiting nearby. "Take it to the lab. Priority processing," he ordered. The technician nodded and moved swiftly toward the IA vehicle. Hayes watched the secured container disappear from sight, sweat rolling down his face. He knew the truth was leaving the scene and entering a process that could not be undone by excuses or lies. Cole stood rigid, face strained to forceful, while a faint twitch pulled at the corner of his mouth. 15 minutes later, Reyes's device chimed. The lab results had returned. He opened the report, his eyes scanning line by line until he reached a section that made him pause, his brows lowering as if confirming a suspicion he had held since receiving the bag. Reyes lifted his head, his gaze locking onto Cole. His voice came out clear, measured, every word sharp. Fingerprints belonged to Officer Cole. Everything around them seemed to freeze. Hayes's eyes widened as though someone had knocked the air out of his lungs. Cole stepped back half a pace before forcing himself upright again, scrambling to hide the shock. Reyes stepped closer, holding the document, and delivered a question that landed with the weight of a direct blow. "Explain." He did not shout, did not grow harsh, yet the cold precision of his tone made the question sound like a verdict waiting for confession. Cole opened his mouth, but no sound formed. His eyes darted toward Hayes, searching for a nod, a lifeline, anything, but Hayes refused to meet his gaze. Sweat rolled down Hayes's temples like the beginning of a reckoning. Marsha stood quietly behind Reyes, her expression neither triumphant nor angry, simply steady, as if she had recognized from the start how this flawed plan would inevitably collapse. A figure stepped out of the second IA vehicle, Grant. His arrival made the already heavy air grow denser. He stood beside Reyes, accepted the report, read it, and then looked directly at Cole. His eyes did not hold anger, but the stern disappointment of someone accustomed to confronting harsh truths. "You handled evidence in the storage room with bare hands," Grant said, his voice slow but certain. "You incriminated yourself." The conclusion struck like a hammer. There was no room left to dodge, to argue, or to shift blame. Fingerprints could not be erased, fabricated, or manipulated, and Cole's own carelessness, his rush in the moment he believed his plan was flawless, had made him forget the most basic detail. His eyes reddened, not from rage but from the realization that the truth had just shattered the shell of authority he had wrapped himself in all night. Hayes stepped farther back, his face drained, lips trembling. He looked at Marsha as if seeing her for the first time. Someone who had stood firm through a setup, threats, and humiliation. Someone they never imagined would bring them to the edge of losing their badges before dawn. Marsha remained silent, her gaze fixed on Grant as he continued documenting the evidence. The truth needed no defense from her. It had spoken through fingerprints, through careless actions, and through every arrogant word Cole and Hayes had uttered. The night stretched on, but the balance had fully shifted. The two men who once stood cloaked in authority now stood at the edge of a ruin they had built for themselves. Silence settled over the scene like a thin layer of dust after a strong gust of wind. Reyes stood straight, the report in his hand glowing under the lights, the cold text visible to everyone present. Cole still had not spoken again, his eyes shifting like someone waking from a nightmare he never believed he could fall into. Grant stepped forward, his black shoes stopping just inches from Cole, his voice firm and steady as it cut through the suffocating quiet. "When did you take the key from the evidence room?" It was not a question meant to gather facts. It was the first step in a sequence of interrogation where the reaction mattered more than the words. Cole swallowed hard, his throat bobbing as if even his breath was stuck. He stammered, eyes refusing to meet theirs. I do not remember." The words were so soft they sounded dragged out of him. It was the worst answer an officer could give in this situation. Not remembering meant no alibi. Not remembering meant every statement could be checked and collapse instantly. Grant did not react or raise an eyebrow, but he shifted his gaze slightly toward Reyes, as if passing the next procedural step forward. Reyes did not wait a second. He lowered the report to his chest, and though his voice was not loud, it was so decisive that the air itself seemed to echo. "I saw you touch it before the seal went on." A simple sentence, yet heavier than any video evidence. It exposed the exact moment Cole touched the evidence with his bare hands, in a room where every item must be handled under strict protocol. The words struck directly at the weakest point of Cole's entire setup. His face drained instantly, as though the blood had been pulled from his body, leaving a washed-out gray under the flashing lights. Cole's breathing turned sharp and shallow, as if he were trying to escape a room with a door that had long been locked. He turned toward Hayes like a man searching for the last piece of solid ground. But Hayes, who had been standing behind him like a shadow all night, suddenly stepped back as if shoved. He took one step, then another, his face pale like wax beneath the stuttering lights. "I had nothing to do with this. It was his idea." His voice burst out fast, high, tangled, as if he were throwing the entire weight of the situation onto his partner to save himself. Cole snapped his head toward Hayes, eyes wide with shock and rage. "You—" He did not finish, because Hayes had already raised his hands in front of his chest, backing away, eyes fixed on Grant and Reyes instead of Cole. He wanted distance, wanted to sever every tie as quickly as possible, because he knew exactly what awaited them once Grant issued a formal decision. Their earlier alliance had turned into betrayal, But Marsha was not surprised. People like them rarely stood together when confronted with the truth. Personal survival always won over the brotherhood they claimed to honor. Grant watched the chaos with the calm of someone who had seen hundreds crumble under evidence they could not deny. He did not intervene in the half-formed argument between the two officers, letting them expose even more of their own mistakes. When Cole and Hayes had hurled every possible accusation at each other, their voices cracking with panic, Grant stepped forward, positioning himself between them like the one tasked with ending the unraveling. He looked at each of them in turn, then returned to the file in his hand, glancing over the fingerprint confirmation before speaking in a cold tone that made the night air seem to stop. "Suspected evidence tampering. Open an investigation immediately." There was no anger in his voice, only finality. But that finality hit Cole and Hayes like a blow. It was not a vague suspicion anymore, nor something contained within internal review. It marked the beginning of a formal investigation, where every report, every fingerprint, every statement could push them straight toward criminal charges. Cole stared at Grant with eyes full of despair. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. Hayes stepped even farther back, gripping the edge of the patrol car door, his face drained as if all strength had left his body. He no longer dared look at Cole or at Marsha, and certainly not at Grant, because he understood exactly who stood before them, the last person any corrupt officer wanted to face. Grant's questions were inescapable, and the lies in front of him always collapsed under the weight of the evidence he gathered. Marsha remained beside them, her calm gaze unchanged from the beginning. She did not speak, did not step into their exchange, because she knew the truth had begun to surface exactly as it was meant to. Her silence now was not the silence of endurance, but the silence of witness. She looked at Cole, the man who had tried to frame her, who had threatened her with violence, now trembling under the lights he once believed symbolized his authority. She looked at Hayes, who had participated in the setup yet had abandoned Cole the moment the truth appeared. And she looked at Grant, the one restoring balance, refusing to let power be misused or injustice go unseen. The night wind swept past, carrying the smell of hot plastic, damp grass, and the heavy silence of two men watching their futures slip out of reach. Grant closed the file and gave Reyes a small nod, the signal to continue the procedure. In that moment, Marsha felt a subtle release, as though the pressure suffocating the night had finally found a way out. But she knew the story was far from over. This was only the beginning of the truth, the part where those who abused power had set themselves on the path to their own downfall. The night wind swept across the road, stirring the trees along the shoulder, as if nature itself were watching each moment of a confrontation that had just shifted into a new phase. Marsha stood steady, observing Reyes and Grant exchange a look, both aware that the situation had moved far beyond a routine traffic stop. Cole's collapse had begun the moment the fingerprint results arrived, but it was far from over. The truth from the lab was only the spark. The real fire came from the authority IA carried, and Grant, the one who had just ordered an evidence-tampering investigation, was preparing to leave an even deeper mark on the night's events. Grant drew a long breath and stepped forward, his shoes forming a clean line between the cold light of the IA vehicle and the flashing patrol car. His expression was severe, not in a show of dominance, but in the way of someone who understood the weight of the words he was about to speak. He glanced briefly at Reyes, as if confirming the process had reached the threshold for the next step. Reyes gave a slight nod. That was all Grant needed to turn fully toward Cole and Hayes, two trembling silhouettes trapped in the chaos they had created. Grant's voice cut through the night, strong, clear, and sharp as a blade, slicing a path through darkness. "Both of you are relieved of duty, effective immediately." The words hit harder than any order they had ever received in their careers. Cole's eyes flew wide, and he stumbled half a step back, as if getting any closer to Grant would strip the last bit of stability from him. Hayes gripped the patrol car door, his face drained, looking as if every drop of blood had been pulled from his body. The red and blue lights continued flashing, reflecting now in the fury spreading across Cole's eyes. He clenched his fists, the faint grind of teeth audible in the tense air. "You have no right," he burst out, the words tearing free in a last desperate attempt to cling to whatever remained before everything collapsed. The protest held no weight, born of fear rather than understanding of the law. Grant did not let him finish. He cut in with a tone that snapped the air tight, stopping Cole mid-breath. "IA always has authority. No excess words, no raised emotion, just truth." And that calm certainty made his statement sharper than any shouted command, slicing through the layers of excuses Cole had tried to build. Grant's eyes, his stance, and the order he had given all made one thing clear. Tonight did not belong to Cole. It belonged to the truth and to the procedure he had chosen to violate. Cole froze, his expression shifting from anger to a stunned emptiness he could no longer hide. In that moment, Marsha saw in his eyes the collapse of a man who had believed power would shield him from every wrongdoing. He braced himself against the hood, his chest rising and falling with breaths fueled by rage tangled with fear. Each inhale hit like a gust thrown off course inside a storm with no exit. Hayes stood a few steps away, breathing hard, his hands trembling. He looked Grant, then at Reyes, then back at Marsha, as if searching for an escape, some sliver of mercy, but every door had already closed. Marsha did not return the look because she knew he was no victim. He had been a full partner in everything that led to this moment. Hayes turned toward Cole again, his voice slipping out like wind squeezing through a crack, thin and weak until it barely held the shape of a complete sentence. "We are finished," he whispered, yet the words rang clearly in the quiet night, sounding like a verdict they had delivered upon themselves. Grant did not react to the murmur. He turned to Reyes and gave a single, decisive nod. Reyes stepped forward, his stance not aggressive but solid as a stone wall. He positioned himself between Cole and Hayes, his voice not loud, but each word landing heavy as granite. "Surrender your badges at the station. No discussion. There was no room for negotiation. This was not discretionary discipline. It was a mandatory procedure when evidence tampering and on-duty misconduct had been triggered." Cole glared at Reyes, but this time no protest left his mouth. Every argument he had tried earlier had shattered the moment the fingerprint report surfaced. He knew that fighting now would only worsen the record and bury him deeper. His eyes drifted toward the open stretch of darkness behind Reyes, the look of someone unable to accept reality, yet with nothing left to cling to. Hayes was different. He bowed his head, his shoulders collapsing as though he had been standing in the rain for hours. Reyes's words severed the last fragile thread of hope he had been clinging to. His eyes flicked toward the patrol car where his badge lay in his pocket, a symbol he had believed just minutes earlier could protect him from anything. Now it was something he was required to surrender, a gesture that marked the end of his authority, his responsibility, and his professional dignity. Reyes stepped forward and pointed toward their vehicle. He did not bark orders or raise his voice, but his cold stare alone stopped any thought of hesitation. Cole gripped his belt, his hand shaking as he reached into the pocket where the badge rested. He pulled it out and stared at it for several seconds as if looking at the career he had built and destroyed with a mistake he had crafted himself. Hayes followed, his hands trembling so hard the badge nearly slipped from his fingers onto the pavement. Grant surveyed the scene without showing satisfaction or disappointment. To him, this was simply the necessary process to ensure justice. But for Marsha, who had stood silently witnessing the shift in power unfold, the moment carried deeper meaning. She did not rejoice at their downfall, yet she understood that justice did not always arrive through shouting or retaliation. Sometimes it appeared through transparency, through procedure, and through truth revealed by fingerprints that could not lie. The air around them eased slightly, though tension still clung to Cole and Hayes like a dust that could not be brushed off. Grant signaled for Reyes to escort them to the IA vehicle to complete the initial paperwork. As they began to walk, Marsha noticed the heaviness in each step they took, the sound of their boots striking the pavement echoing like the fading remnants of a career being taken from them. Reyes followed behind, his voice steady and firm, keeping their pace strict and unavoidable. Suspension notices will be delivered tonight, and from this moment forward, neither of you has access to any files, rooms, or evidence. The two figures moved farther into the glow of the IA vehicle, where the open door waited. Marsha watched them go, not with anger, but with a sense of closure. Tonight had revealed truths they could never undo. Two officers who once believed themselves untouchable now faced the very rules they had dismissed, and what awaited them would be far harsher once the official case began. Grant turned back toward Marsha. His eyes made clear the story was not finished, that this would have to run to the end of truth. Marsha gave a small nod, words unnecessary. She knew the road ahead was long, but tonight's step was enough to prove that justice might arrive late. Yet, when it arrives, it misses no one. The interrogation room sat under cold white light, the soft hum of the air system stretching like an endless sigh. The metal table in the center reflected distorted shapes of the people around it, and the tension hanging in the air made every movement feel heavy. Grant leaned lightly against the edge of the table, file in hand, his gaze sharp as a blade, as he studied the two suspended officers. Cole sat on the left, slumped in his chair like someone drained of every ounce of strength. Hayes sat across from him, fingers interlaced, yet trembling with each breath. A few other IA personnel stood silent in the corner, their presence adding pressure without a single spoken word. Grant slid a report to the middle of the table and turned it toward Cole. Cole's eyes fell on the familiar lines he could not deny. His fingerprints are on the evidence. The evidence is the missing key found in Marsha's trunk, and it was not accidental. His lip twitched, his throat tightening as Grant asked, steady and direct, "Can you explain why your fingerprints are here?" The calm tone alone startled Cole, snapping his mouth open as someone splashed with cold water. He gripped the sides of his chair, shoulders trembling, then abruptly shoved the blame toward Hayes. "Hayes told me to do it. I just followed orders." The words burst out fast, desperate, like a drowning man grabbing at the last floating piece of debris. He spoke in a rush, eyes darting toward Hayes in panic, trying to push the exploding blame into his former partner's hands. "I didn't think it was that serious." He said, "Just do it, and he'd handle the rest." Hayes shot up from his chair, the screech of metal legs scraping the floor cutting through the room. He slammed his hand on the table hard enough to make it shake, the reports trembling from the impact. "You are lying. I never touched that key." Hayes growled each word, pressing them down like layers of dirt burying coal deeper. His eyes burned red with a mix of anger and fear. An accomplice, only minutes earlier, he now clawed to rebuild a boundary that separated him from Cole, and he did it by denying every connection to the evidence. "I never entered the evidence room today. I never handled anything. That never happened." Chaos burst between them, their accusations crashing into each other like a windstorm tightening the room until it felt smaller, harder, heavier. Cole leaned forward, slamming his palms against the table as if to reclaim control of the narrative. "You suggested it. You said the car matched the one on the missing report. You said planting the key would lock her in as a suspect." His voice climbed, shaky and wild, as though his own thoughts were spiraling out of reach. "You said it. I'm not making this up." Hayes clenched his jaw, his eyes sparking with fury. "What exactly did I say? Do you have proof? Do you have a recording? Hear me clearly, Cole. I had nothing to do with that. You took the key, you touched it. Do not drag me down just to save yourself." His words landed not only as a denial, but as a clean slice, severing whatever connection they once had. Two men who had worked in sync at the scene were now tearing each other apart in the interrogation room, each sentence pushing the other deeper into the pit. Grant let the clash unfold for a few seconds, observing every expression, because this chaos would become become a valuable part of the investigation file. Marsha sat opposite them, not to intervene, but to recount the events as IA required. The white light cast across her face highlighted the steadiness she had carried from the moment the traffic stop began until now. Grant glanced at her, signaling it was her turn. Marsha drew a short, quiet breath, then began recounting every moment. Her voice did not shake, did not waver. It was even and clear. They repeatedly insulted me, searched me, planted evidence on me. Each sentence placed another stone on the path toward truth. There was no anger, no bitterness, only a precise retelling of what happened. Their words, their actions, the coercion, and the moment the evidence appeared where it never should have been. Grant wrote steadily, but did not interrupt her. He let her finish because Marsha spoke not to condemn, but to create the most transparent account possible for the investigation. Cole tried several times to cut in, to argue or deny, but Reyes placed a firm hand on his shoulder, reminding him he was in interrogation, not back on a roadside shouting match. Marsha continued, detailing the unjustified search, the deliberate setup, and the moment Cole signaled Hayes to distract her while he circled behind the car. When she finished, the room fell into a silence so heavy that one could hear every tap of Grant's pen on paper. He wrote the final lines, then lifted his gaze toward Cole and Hayes. "Her statement aligns with the evidence," he said, his tone flat, carrying no emotion, only fact. The sentence made Cole slump back in his chair, eyes wide, while Hayes pressed his lips together, his shoulders collapsing. Grant flipped to the next page, continuing to lock the investigation into structure. From his expression, Marsha knew he was sorting what had been said into two categories, truth and self-incrimination. Meanwhile, Hayes darted uneasy glances between Grant and Cole, the fear in his eyes deepening with every passing second. Cole looked hollowed out, hands trembling on his knees, his skin ashen like someone standing on the edge between loss and despair. Grant set his pen down, his gaze sharp on the two men driving themselves into a dead end. What unfolded before Marsha showed her that the long night had never been only a fight on the roadside. It was a battle between justice and corruption inside a brightly lit room, and tonight, justice held the advantage. The notification tone from the device in the interrogation room cut through the air like a blade slicing into an atmosphere already stretched to the point of suffocation. Grant lifted his head, glancing toward Reyes, who was checking a new message from the forensic lab. The screen's glow reflected off Reyes's face, darkening his expression even further. He read quickly, then handed the tablet to Grant, as if the contents were heavy enough to alter the entire trajectory of the night's investigation. Grant scanned a few lines, his eyes pausing for a beat before he set the device on the table and turned the screen toward Cole and Hayes. The overhead light flickered across each word, illuminating every lie the two men had constructed throughout the night. Supplemental findings from the lab, Grant read slowly, each word dropping onto the metal table like droplets onto still water, creating ripples that could not be ignored. Only Cole's prints, no one else's. The statement didn't need emphasis. Its weight carried itself, pushing through every layer of defense Cole had tried to build. Marsha watched calmly from the side, tilting her head slightly, as if confirming what she had already suspected. The moment Reyes opened the trunk, the moment Cole hesitated, the moment he failed to answer Grant's questions, all of it had pointed toward the conclusion the lab had just delivered. Cole opened his mouth, but no sound followed. He blinked rapidly, as though trying to grasp at an explanation his panicked mind could no longer produce. The tremor in his fingertips climbed up his wrist and dragged down his forearm like an invisible weight, pulling him apart. He swallowed hard, but his throat was so dry the sound caught halfway. He could no longer speak, because any sentence he uttered now would turn into evidence against him. Grant slowly slid the file closer to Cole, his voice steady and sharp, slicing truth away from fabrication. If the key were legitimate, it would show the owner's prints. It doesn't. The room fell into a stillness so heavy that even the hum of the air conditioner seemed to blend with the ragged breaths of the two suspended officers. Whoever owns the car would naturally leave prints on the key. That's basic forensic procedure. He paused just long enough for the unspoken verdict to settle over Cole like a descending shadow. But there are no prints from Marsha. Hayes swallowed so hard, the movement in his throat was visible under the stark white light. That fact severed the final thread of hope he'd been clinging to. His trembling worsened, his hands lacing together and then pulling apart again as if searching for something to hold on to. But nothing in this room could save him. His pupils widened as he turned to look at Cole, and in that instant, the hardened facade he'd been clinging to all night collapsed like soil washed away by a flood. Hayes broke down crying. The first sob was small, caught in his throat, then cracked open into a shaking, choking sound. "He dragged me into this. I'll tell everything." He pulled his chair closer, both hands trembling violently as if begging for a forgiveness he knew he didn't deserve. His voice splintered, but every word was clear, spilling out like a breached dam. "I didn't want to do it. Cole said it was the easiest way to frame her. He said the key had already been picked from the evidence room. He said all we had to do was put it in place." Cole snapped toward him, growling, though his voice was nothing more than the ragged breath of a man collapsing. "Shut up. You're part of this. Ooh." He tried to rise, but Reyes placed a firm hand on his shoulder, forcing him back down. Cole looked at Reyes, then at Grant, but neither gaze offered sympathy. They watched him the way one watches a man digging deeper into his own grave. Hayes dropped his head onto the table, tears falling in steady drops onto the files. "I'll tell everything. I'll talk. I'll say it all," he stammered between shaky breaths. "I'm not losing everything because of him." The confession, though unprompted, poured out like the final desperate act of a man trying to salvage whatever remained of his life. Grant turned another page in the file, each movement so steady it only deepened the despair settling over the two unraveling men. He lowered his pen, the faint tap against the paper sounding like a punctuation mark sealing the fate of a story they had fought to stretch. He looked directly at Cole and Hayes, his voice low, clear, dividing the room into two sides, the side of those who abused power and the side of the truth now laid bare. This was not a mistake. This was intentional abuse of authority. The statement held no bark, no slammed fist, yet its weight made Cole collapse back into his chair, his breath bursting out like someone had struck him in the chest. Hayes sank even lower, like a house made of thin plaster dissolving under a storm. Truth had spoken. There was no denial left, no detour, no invented explanation that could shift the facts. Grant continued writing, eyes on the file, though each word he spoke fell like a judge's hammer in a trial that had not yet begun. Using fabricated evidence, staging a scene, and coercing a statement are far beyond an internal policy violation. You will both face a full investigation. Both of you will face legal consequences. There was no anger in Grant's tone, only precision. This was the nature of IA. Justice does not shout, does not threaten. Justice stands firm, clear, and unwavering. Marsha sat slightly angled as she watched the scene unfold, not because she wished to see them fall, but because the truth was finally being set in its rightful place. Calmness settled across her face as though she had foreseen this moment from the instant they began insulting and threatening her on the roadside. She did not nod, did not sigh, yet the steadiness in her eyes said she had been waiting for this moment, the way one waits for the final bell ending a battle that had stretched on since her car was stopped in the night. Reyes added the last notes to Hayes' statement while Grant closed the file. The soft click echoed through the quiet room. In that moment, Cole lowered his head, his chest collapsing inward with each desperate breath. Hayes pressed his forehead against the back of his hand, tears still falling, as though he mourned his own decisions more than the victim they tried to frame. The interrogation room seemed to widen as the truth surfaced. All lies had been stripped away, every layer of deceit peeled back. Justice took another step forward, and the ones who tried to distort it crumpled beneath the weight of the wrongdoing they themselves had created. The air in the interrogation room felt like a space locked shut for many hours, growing heavier with the exhaustion, anxiety, and fear consuming the two men at the far end of the metal table. After Grant's final conclusion, Cole sat frozen for several seconds, his eyes darkening as though the entire world had just caved in before him. Hayes kept his head bowed, tears still clinging to the corners of his eyes, his breathing uneven like someone whose endurance had finally run out. The room sank into a suffocating silence, not the kind that brings peace, but the kind that echoes like the snap of bridge cables, signaling that the last moment before collapse has arrived. That silence was torn apart when Cole shot up from his chair, the metal scraping back and slamming against the floor with a shrill screech like steel dragged across stone. He jabbed a finger toward Hayes's face, his eyes bloodshot, his features twisted by a mixture of rage and despair. "You turned on me?" he shouted, each word fired like an arrow meant to pierce the fragile defense Hayes was trying to rebuild. It was the outburst of a man who knew he was sinking, but still clawed for something to cling to, even if that something was the partner who helped him dig the hole. Hayes flinched, but did not stand. He avoided Cole's eyes, knowing that meeting them would either break him completely or drag him back into the pit he was trying to climb out of. His shoulders trembled, not with sobs now, but with shame and fear eating into every muscle. He stared at the metal table, at the dull stains left by his own tears. His voice came out soft, cracked, but clear, as though he needed to say it before the weight in his chest crushed him. I can't cover for you anymore." Quiet as it was, Cole heard it. He heard every sound, every letter, every trembling breath behind the words. Grant remained still, his gaze sharp, watching the situation unfold like a controlled chain reaction he had anticipated from the beginning. Reyes did not move, hands ready, prepared to stop any sudden outburst from Cole. Marsha observed in silence, her expression holding no satisfaction, only the steady calm of someone who has seen too much to feel triumph in another's collapse. She understood that this moment was necessary for the truth to stand, yet she also knew that people shatter most violently in the moments they are forced to confront themselves. Hayes drew in a sharp breath, then lifted his head to look at Grant, though his eyes were still red. He spoke again, this time without trembling, as if he were finally releasing years of pressure that had been trapped inside him. "He's done this to others before." His voice was low and heavy, like a stone dropped into a deep well. The statement did more than accuse Cole. It accused the entire system that had allowed those abuses to survive for so long without challenge. He continued, his tone gaining clarity as each word left him like a burden finally lifted. "I've seen him take things from people he stopped. I've seen him fabricate reports. I've seen him use force when it wasn't needed." He looked straight at Grant, his eyes filled with the despair of someone who has stayed silent too long. "And I never dared to say a word." Cole slammed both hands on the table, the sharp crack cutting through the room like a bolt of lightning. "All of that is a lie," he roared, but the pitch had broken, stripped of the edge belonging to a man who always believed he was in the right. He looked at Grant, then at Reyes, then at Marsha, but none of them offered him a lifeline. He turned toward Hayes, his eyes wild, unable to comprehend the betrayal of the colleague who once stood beside him. "You're making this up. You know I didn't do that." He stammered, but the sentence collapsed, strangled by the truth now filling the room. But the truth was already apparent. Cole's denials wavered, shaking like a streetlight pole in a storm, and the more they shook, the more they confirmed that Hayes's words were not one-sided. Each time Cole tried to steady his voice, he only revealed how little ground he had left. His denials no longer carried weight because they came from a man who had already been betrayed by his own fingerprints. Grant didn't slam the table, didn't raise his voice. He simply stood straight, hands resting lightly on the case file, his voice calm calm as still water but carrying the force to crack stone. "You've both just weakened your entire defense." The statement was quiet, but it struck directly at the core of their collapse. It wasn't an accusation, but a clear conclusion from someone with solid legal ground beneath him. Cole and Hayes had not been defeated by Grant, nor by Reyes, nor by Marsha. They were defeated by their own words, by their fear when faced with the truth, by the years of misconduct finally exposed in full for the first time. Cole stepped back, one hand pressed to his forehead like a man just waking from a nightmare he still couldn't escape. Hayes collapsed deeper into his chair, his chest rising and falling like someone who had run a long distance without realizing he'd been running at all. The interrogation room felt wider now, yet colder too, as though the testimonies just spoken had drained away the last trace of warmth. Marsha watched them, but there was no venom or triumph in her eyes. She understood that every truth brought into the light carried a kind of loss with it, but she also knew that sometimes a collapse is necessary so that what is right can finally stand. Grant gathered the files, stepped back a pace, marking the shift in the investigation into its next stage. No more arguments, no more fabrications, no more clumsy performances. From here, only truth remained, along with procedure and the consequences awaiting those who had tried to bend justice with their own hands. The IA conference room was brighter than the interrogation room, the white lights reflecting off the long table covered in files, procedural charts, and copies of investigative reports. The tension remained, but it had shifted into a disciplined, deliberate atmosphere, as if the entire room had been built to dissect the truth with cold precision. Marsha sat on the right side of the table, her shoulder angled slightly for comfort, though her eyes stayed fixed on Grant as he reviewed the notes gathered from Cole and Hayes' statements. Reyes stood behind him, arms crossed, his calm expression carrying an unmistakable confidence in the process IA was executing. They were no longer crisis responders at a chaotic scene, but professionals stepping into a deeper arena where every word and every piece of evidence was examined under the lens of responsibility. Grant set the file down, lifting his gaze toward Marsha as though preparing to open a new chapter of the meeting. He looked at her with a respect that he made no attempt to hide, because throughout the interrogation and investigation, Marsha had shown steadiness, legal clarity, and a level of composure that had drawn IA's attention from the start. She was not a passive participant, not someone who simply endured what had happened. She was someone who understood her rights, her duties, and the seriousness of every action taken by the two officers. Grant laced his fingers together, nodded once, and spoke clearly. "What weaknesses do you see in their patrol procedure?" The question was not merely a request for commentary. It was an invitation for Marsha to step fully into the professional role she possessed, a role she no longer needed to conceal once her identity had been confirmed. The room fell silent for a beat, making space for her response, because Grant and the IA team knew that the perspective of a field-tested officer like Marsha was essential for the reform report they would soon assemble. Marsha straightened, her hands resting lightly in front of her, her gaze steady and sharp like someone analyzing a battlefield before moving into the next phase of a mission. She began speaking in a low, even tone, not the voice of someone recounting mistreatment, but of an expert evaluating systemic flaws. "Improper approach," she said first, laying the foundation for the analysis IA was waiting for. "They approached the vehicle with an authoritative posture from the start, gave no reason for the stop, and made no effort to assess whether there was an actual threat. That goes against safety protocol in every patrol situation," Grant wrote immediately, while Reyes nodded subtly, recognizing the accuracy of the assessment. Marsha continued without hesitation, her words flowing as though she had cataloged every violation in real time and had only been waiting for the right moment to assemble them. "Improper search," she said, her voice as firm as steel. "They opened the vehicle doors without legal grounds, failed to notify the driver of their actions, and proceeded to damage personal property. They acted without a warrant, without evidence, without any sign of threat from me. She looked at Grant, her eyes steady, leaving no room for doubt. They were searching for something they didn't even know existed. That alone proves this wasn't a routine check. Grant kept writing, his pen moving across the page as though trying to keep pace with the precision of her analysis. Every point Marsha raised cut cleanly through Cole and Hayes' misconduct, outlining each violation that IA would be required to document in the official report. She continued, her voice dropping slightly, as if placing emphasis on the most critical part. Improper evidence handling, she said, her gaze shifting to the evidence file resting at the center of the table. The item appeared in my vehicle even though they had never conducted a prior inspection. There was no on-scene sealing procedure, and no independent witness was present. When they found it, they did not read a report, did not verify ownership, did not explain how the evidence could possibly be connected to the vehicle at all. She looked directly at Grant again, and the next line left her lips like an arrow hitting its mark. Everything points to intent, not suspicion, not an emotional assumption, a conclusion built from actions, procedure, and the evidence IA already held. Her words tightened the room, drawing a brief pause from both Grant and Reyes as they registered the weight behind her statement. She was no longer speaking as a victim, but as a trained officer, one who had seen from the start that this was a constructed setup, not a mistake made by two patrol cops. IA recorded every point with the precision of a technical audit. A staff member opened a laptop and began typing Marsha's assessments into the procedural review section. The rhythmic tapping of keys echoed through the quiet room, like the heartbeat of a justice system being rebuilt piece by piece. Reyes mentally reviewed each item, checking for consistency, comparing her statements with the video logs, medical records, internal reports, and forensic results. Every time Marsha gave another insight, he tilted his head slightly in confirmation, because nothing she said contradicted the evidence. If anything, her analysis exposed angles IA might have overlooked during the initial review. Grant set his pen down after finishing the last line of notes, then looked at Marsha as if recognizing the missing piece of the investigative puzzle. "These recommendations will be included in the reform report," he said, his tone carrying the conviction of someone who never promises what he cannot deliver. He wasn't speaking merely to reassure her. He was speaking as IA, making a commitment that tonight's work would not end in this room. It would become policy, protocol, and mandatory training for patrol units, eliminating the kind of abuses Cole and Hayes had committed. Grant's words made the entire room feel brighter for a moment, not a physical brightness, but the light of a necessary shift. Marsha looked at him and gave a calm nod. She wasn't seeking praise or an apology. She only wanted to ensure that what happened to her tonight would not happen again to any other black person or any other civilian. She wanted the humiliation, violence, and abuse of power she had endured to become an ending point, not the beginning of more cases just like it. Reyes stepped forward, reviewing the notes on the computer screen, then turned to Marsha with an expression of respect that only someone who fully recognizes another's capability can show. "You were very clear," he said, his voice low but warm. "Your analysis helps us see the entire set of weaknesses, not just in this case, but in the whole patrol system." Marsha nodded slightly, offering no reply because she knew she had fulfilled the role she needed to play. The room grew quiet again, but this time it was the silence of people who had just laid the groundwork for real reform. Marsha looked at the open files on the table and felt the shift taking shape within those pages. She understood that the fight against abuse of power wouldn't end in one night, but every statement she made, every technical assessment, every piece of evidence she helped clarify added another support to the bridge of justice for those who would come after her. And tonight, she was the voice being heard, not because she had been harmed, but because she understood what was right, what was wrong, and what needed to change. The next morning, the IA headquarters rested under the pale sunlight of a new day, yet the atmosphere carried the weight of the most significant disciplinary meeting in months. The conference room was spacious, with white lights spreading evenly across the neatly arranged documents on the table, each page bearing traces of hours of intense investigation, conflicting statements, and undeniable evidence. Marsha sat in the observer's seat, slightly toward the back, quietly watching the scene. She no longer intervened in the process, for it had entered the legal stage that the IA handled, but her presence held the meaning of a neutral witness, someone who had lived through the entire ordeal from the moment it began to the moment it was brought into the light. Cole and Hayes were escorted into the room, each seated at one end of the table, separated by enough distance to prevent a repeat of their earlier chaotic arguments. Cole looked worn down, like someone who had not slept all night. He kept his head lowered as soon as he entered, his face gaunt, his lips dry and cracked, his eyes stripped of the aggression they once held. Hayes sat silently, hands resting on his thighs, occasionally glancing toward Grant before lowering his head again. The pressure from the interrogation, from his own testimony, and from the forensic evidence had drained him. Yet in Hayes's eyes lingered a faint hope that cooperation and confession might spare him from the harshest punishment. Grant stood at the head of the table, holding a file that had been reviewed multiple times. He opened the first page, drew in a quiet breath, then began to read, his voice firm and direct like a verdict already weighed carefully. Cole is recommended for prosecution on charges of entrapment and armed intimidation. The declaration made Cole snap his head up, eyes widening in shock. He tried lifting his shoulders as if to react, but froze when he saw Reyes's watchful gaze tracking every movement. Grant continued without pausing to observe him. The deliberate placement of evidence in another person's vehicle, combined with weapon-based intimidation, created a dangerous environment and exceeded the lawful limits of a patrol officer. Each word struck like a hammer on metal, forging an indictment that could alter Cole's entire life from this day forward. He clenched his hand into a fist, biting down on his lip to keep himself from protesting, for he had already experienced enough to understand that legal truth no longer bent to his anger. Every statement, every piece of evidence, every fingerprint was a rope binding him to the charges he had built with his own hands. Grant turned to Hayes, his tone slightly gentler, though still firm. Hayes is accountable as an accomplice, but will be considered for leniency. Hearing this, Hayes's shoulders trembled, not with joy but with the feeling of being pulled back from a cliff he thought he could not escape. Tears gathered at his lash line, though he tried to stay composed. Grant continued, "Your cooperation and full disclosure allow for an adjusted disciplinary measure. However, you are still responsible for enabling the misconduct and failing to intervene when your partner exceeded his authority." Hayes nodded slowly, and the lowering of his head was not merely an admission of guilt, but an acknowledgement that he had made mistakes and was now facing the consequences. Even with leniency, he still had to pay for his actions, but at the very least, he no longer had to carry the weight of lying or scrambling for excuses. Grant turned to the next page, his voice clearer as he read the disciplinary ruling. "Both of you are permanently stripped of authority." The room fell into a dense silence. No sharp breaths, no scraping chairs, only the heavy emptiness settling between two men who once believed their badges would protect them from all wrongdoing. Marsha looked at Cole and saw him shrink in on himself like an animal cornered. Losing the badge was not merely losing a job, it was losing its identity, the thing they clung to for their sense of worth in society, the thing they used to impose power on others. And now it was taken from them because of the very actions they committed. Hayes bowed his head lower, his hands clasped but no longer shaking. He knew this was the end of his career, but it was also a chance to avoid the criminal path Cole now faced. Cole gave a faint shake of his head, eyes vacant as if refusing to accept reality. If he could speak, he would scream, swear, and deny. But he had burned through all his defiance during the long hours of interrogation. Now he had only the silence of someone completely defeated. Grant closed the file, though his voice remained steady, neither harsh nor hurried. He delivered the final statement, the one Marsha knew would become the foundation of the IA's full report. Your actions run contrary to every value of this profession. He looked directly at the two men before him, avoiding neither and exaggerating nothing. A police officer's duty is to protect, not to intimidate. Authority is granted to uphold justice, not to turn civilians into targets for abuse. You have broken the trust the department placed in you. In that moment, Marsha's eyes lowered slightly, as though she felt the moral weight behind his words. This was not merely a ruling on the misconduct of Cole and Hayes. It was a declaration to everyone who wore the uniform that power is not a shield, but a responsibility. It was also a message to those who had suffered injustice as she had, that justice still existed even if it sometimes arrived by a long road. Cole exhaled, a long, heavy breath like the collapse of an old wall. Hayes wiped his face, trying to regain composure. Grant signaled for Reyes to escort them to the waiting area for final processing. As they stood, Marsha watched them go, not with hatred, but with calm acceptance. She knew what they faced from this day forward and no longer concerned herself. The path of justice had reached its decisive point and now belonged to the law. The conference room door closed behind them, leaving a strange, quiet peace in its wake. Grant looked at Marsha and gave a small nod of thanks. She rose and returned the gesture, knowing that the long night had finally come to a fitting end. News spread faster than anyone could have predicted. Just hours after the disciplinary decision was announced, major and minor outlets alike began publishing reports, with headlines flooding the phone screens of thousands. 2 officers frame, female seal. The phrase appeared in bold, front and center on newspapers both local and national, followed by analyses, feature segments, and live televised discussions. The rigid lines of print quickly ignited a fuse long buried in the public psyche, where frustration over abuse of power, racial bias, and the lack of transparency in law enforcement had been building for years. Television networks recreated the incident with animated diagrams, interviewed experts, and dissected traffic stop procedures, along with the loopholes that enabled misconduct. Many journalists argued that Marsha's case was not an isolated failure, but a symbol of the silent injustices countless Americans endure daily. Some commentators called it a bucket of cold water on the system, while others labeled it a turning point forcing police to confront themselves. These words surged across social media, shared by millions who voiced outrage, support, or weary recognition. Within that wave of public reaction, the most unexpected voices came from those long forgotten. People who had been harassed by Cole and Hayes finally stepped forward, many for the first time in years, to tell their stories. A middle-aged man said Cole once threatened to impound his car despite any violations. A young woman recalled being kept roadside for hours by Hayes simply because she looked suspicious. A black teenager recounted how Cole forced him to open his trunk and backpack in the rain, even though his paperwork was complete. Stories once buried under fear and helplessness were now pulled into the open, forming essential pieces of the larger picture of misconduct many had chosen to ignore. As the number of testimonies grew by the hour, they stopped being scattered anecdotes and became a chorus of statements applying severe pressure on the police department. Press conferences had to be rescheduled as the department scrambled to respond to mounting community outrage. Reporters fired questions in rapid succession, leaving the department's spokesperson flustered and evasive. How did Cole and Hayes remain on the force for so long? How many internal complaints against them were ignored? Was there any cover-up? Each question struck like a needle piercing through layers of institutional denial, shaking the department's leadership under the weight of public scrutiny. Online forums are filled with discussions about the need for police reform, with citizens proposing transparent procedures, renewed de-escalation training, and improved systems for monitoring officer conduct. Several community groups organized meetings to support victims who had never dared to speak publicly before. Analytical clips breaking down Marsha's encounters spread widely, drawing thousands of comments praising her composure and decisiveness under threat. Images of Marsha, from the moment she stood before the flashing patrol lights to the moment she delivered her precise analysis to IA, were shared as proof of the strength found in steady resolve and courage. Meanwhile, the police department came under unprecedented pressure to restructure. City councils demanded a full investigation into the operations of the unit Cole and Hayes belonged to. Policies on searches, vehicle stops, and evidence handling were placed on the emergency review list. Local lawmakers issued statements promising a push for deeper reform, calling for stronger oversight and greater transparency from the police. Some civil rights organizations labeled this a turning point, describing it as a catalyst for transforming how officers interact with their communities. Amid all the upheaval, Marsha became a symbol of unwavering steadiness, not because she pushed back with shouting or by invoking her rank, but because she chose to confront the situation with calm and principle. She never lost her dignity or allowed herself to be dragged into chaos. She stood firm, observed, analyzed, and delivered each word with the precision of someone trained for battles of this exact nature. People respected her, not for being a SEAL, but for clarity, directness, and unshaken integrity, even while being falsely accused. Articles dissecting her conduct appeared everywhere. One major paper wrote, "Marsha's composure is a lesson for the entire police force." A well-known commentator said on live television, what she did wasn't defiance. It was the honest face of justice confronting abuse of power. Thousands left comments thanking her for standing up in their place, those who had stayed silent out of fear. One person wrote, "Thank you for showing us that calm can be powerful." Another said, "Without you, this would have been buried like so many other cases." Public reaction kept spreading, but instead of focusing solely on outrage, it began shifting toward hope. Hope that what happened to Marsha would wake the system up. Hope that the truth revealed in her case wouldn't end as a one-off incident, but would become the driving force behind building a stronger, more transparent police force. Marsha didn't speak to the press, didn't try to become a public figure. She let the story move on its own merit. Yet, even in her silence, people saw her as proof that justice sometimes isn't protected by weapons, but by character. Late in the afternoon, after scrolling through a few articles on her phone, Marsha set it down gently, drifting into quiet thought. She didn't feel proud or triumphant. She simply felt the relief of knowing the truth had finally been seen. Outside, traffic rushed through a city full of noise and life, but to Marsha, it sounded like the steady heartbeat of a society yearning for change. And although she didn't want to become a banner for anyone, she understood that sometimes a single flame is enough to light the path for many others to follow. The large city council chamber glowed under the bright ceiling light, its rows of seats arranged in straight, disciplined lines, and at the front, a long table where the council members sat in a single row. The atmosphere today was unlike any routine session. It was thick with anticipation, mixed with curiosity and the unresolved outrage of the past few days. Reporters packed the designated area, cameras and recorders aimed at the podium as though waiting for the moment Marsha would step forward. But when she entered, the vast room fell unexpectedly silent. So quiet, she could hear the sound of her shoes against the stone floor. No whispers, no shifting chairs, everything settling as if to make space for a moment. "Man, you were already calling a turning point in the reform effort." Marsha stood at the podium, her eyes sweeping the room in a brief circle. Grant sat below, leaning slightly forward like a silent confirmation of IA's presence at the hearing. Reyes stood farther back along the row of seats, arms crossed as he watched with a steady, quiet gaze. When Marsha rested her hand on the edge of the podium, The entire chamber seemed to hold its breath, and she began with a single sentence that made everyone lift their heads. Justice cannot depend on the color of a person's skin. Her voice rang clear, each word piercing the air like a fine needle cutting through prejudices rooted for generations. When the sentence ended, the chamber sank into a silence so deep that Marsha could feel her own heartbeat blending into it. No one moved. No one spoke. The council, press, and everyone who had waited days for this hearing paused together to absorb the meaning carried in her words. Marsha continued softly, without raising her voice or posturing, letting her composure guide everything. She recounted the moment she had a gun wrongly pointed at her, as though pulling a truth from memory that she had held back because she knew an emotional outburst could have made things worse. When I turned and saw the gun aimed at me, I understood clearly that any breath that fell out of rhythm could become the reason I never went home again. I have seen that happen to many others before. I know exactly how thin the line is between life and death when an officer lets anger decide his actions. Her voice did not shake. It stayed even, low, and carried the weight of someone who had lived inside that feeling long enough to understand a fear that defies language. The chamber could not record that moment with cameras, but it recorded it with silence. It was the silence of people hearing, for the first time, the truth spoken by the person who lived it, a truth the public had only seen through articles and clipped excerpts in the news. Marsha continued, this time her voice lowering as if holding the entirety of an experience she had never shared with anyone except IA. I hope what kept me alive was not luck. She looked directly at the council's front row, where the small wooden gavels symbolize the power to make policy, but the system we are trying to rebuild, a system that ensures anyone, whether white or black, whether military or civilian, is treated with respect and proper legal procedure. A few council members nodded lightly, others narrowed their eyes as though fighting to keep their reactions contained. But the clearest sign came from the absolute silence, a silence carrying both sorrow and admiration for the woman standing before them. Marsha did not use tears or a sharp voice to recount what she endured. She spoke with a calmness that made anyone listening feel the weight of her experience, and that very calmness gave her story more strength than any fierce condemnation could. The council was moved by her composure. One older member set his pen down and adjusted his glasses, as if wiping away the sudden blur on the lenses. Another leaned forward, elbows on the table, his gaze focused not with scrutiny, but with genuine attention. Everyone in the room sensed that Marsha was not there to accuse, but to remind them of the responsibility they carry. The responsibility of a system that cannot allow its citizens to feel threatened by the very force meant to protect them. When she finished her statement, no one applauded right away, not because they did not want to, but because they needed a moment to gather the thoughts shaken loose by her words. Then, from one corner of the room, the soft tap of a pen against a table broke the stillness, followed by a ripple of silent acknowledgement in the eyes of many. Respect did not need theatrics. It lived in the fact that everyone had been quiet enough to truly hear her. Grant rose and stepped toward the podium. He did not look at the cameras or the reporters, but directly at Marsha, with a respect rarely shown to citizens who file complaints or reports. "You helped us see the larger issue," Grant said, his voice low but firm, not only from the perspective of someone who was harmed, but from the perspective of an officer who understands how this system is supposed to function and how far it has drifted from its standards. That remark made the entire room look at Marsha from a different angle, no longer seeing her as someone who had been harassed, but as someone shaping the future direction of the institution. Grant continued with a few statements about the responsibility of reform and how IA would propose new procedures based on the analysis Marsha had provided. But it was his first sentence, the direct expression of gratitude, that made Marsha give a slight nod. She did not smile, maintaining her familiar calm. Yet, in that moment, the council, The reporters and those watching online all understood that this hearing was not meant to spotlight wrongdoing, but to open a new path for justice, and Marsha, through her own steadiness and resolve, had become the one to clear that path. In the days following Marsha's hearing, the atmosphere in the city seemed to change its rhythm. Newspapers no longer focused solely on the misconduct of Cole and Hayes, but began shifting toward the sweeping reforms the police department was now forced to implement. Inside the department's administrative building, meetings ran from early morning until late at night, where captains, inspectors, and legal advisors argued over every detail to build new procedures. These were no longer perfunctory meetings. This time, they had to confront the most important question: how to keep abuse of power from ever slipping into the system again. The new anti-abuse protocol was rolled out just a week later. The steps for approaching a stopped vehicle were rewritten with greater specificity, including the requirement to clearly state the reason for the stop and to record the entire process with mandatory equipment. Regulations on searching vehicles and personal property were expanded with a cross-monitoring clause requiring the presence of another officer as a witness and the drafting of documentation on the spot. Most importantly, the section concerning evidence handling was completely rebuilt, requiring immediate sealing procedures with 2 independent signatures to eliminate any opportunity for manipulation. All of it was formalized, stamped, and circulated internally as a declaration that Cole's misconduct would not be allowed to repeat. When the new protocol was announced, Reyes received formal commendation from IA and the police department. During an internal meeting, he was awarded a certificate recognizing his integrity and adherence to legal procedure on the night Marsha was stopped. He stood before his colleagues, pausing for a moment out of surprise, but his eyes remained as steady as they had been at the scene. Marsha was present that day, standing a few rows back, watching the moment as if it were an essential step in a broader path toward change. Reyes bowed his head as he accepted the commendation, and though he did not say much, his presence alone was proof that even within a flawed system, there were always people who chose to do what was right. The room applauded, not to praise an individual, but out of relief at seeing a positive example acknowledged at the right time. At the same time, anti-bias training became mandatory for the entire force. No longer the theoretical workshops of the past, this time the police department partnered with sociologists, psychologists, and civil organizations to build a more practical program. Simulated scenarios were introduced in which officers had to confront unconscious reactions, prejudices, and improper commands to learn how to recognize and adjust their behavior. These sessions made many reconsider the way they asked questions, the way they approached civilians, and the way they had unknowingly allowed bias to influence their decisions. During one training session, a young officer shared that he had never realized asking, "What job do you have to drive this car?" was an expression of racial bias until he saw how that question could make the person being asked feel insulted. Reactions like that spread throughout the class, creating a shift that was subtle but deeply felt. No one claimed the training would eliminate all misconduct, but it opened the necessary foundation for each officer to examine themselves before taking action. The shift within the police department grew clearer each day. In the cafeteria, conversations among colleagues became more candid about racial bias and personal responsibility. In the hallways, many officers stopped to thank Reyes for choosing to do the right thing during a tense situation. Some, who had once worried about IA's deeper involvement in patrol operations, now viewed it as a measure that made their work safer. The way officers approached civilians changed slightly, but enough to create a sense of respect and transparency on both sides. Marsha, though no longer present in the meetings, still felt that movement when she walked past the precinct to sign documents related to the case. The officers she encountered nodded to her, not because she was a SEAL, but because they saw her as someone who created an opportunity to rebuild the department's credibility. She stepped out of the building with the warm sunlight on her shoulders, as if the whole sky had eased after days of tension. Though this reform could not solve every issue, it opened a new chapter, a chapter where gaps were closed, honest voices were heard, and people who had once been silenced now had a chance at fair treatment. The internal environment became more positive, officers looked at one another with greater empathy, and, most importantly, civilians began to feel safer when interacting with the force entrusted to protect them. Marsha knew change did not come from a single decision or a single speech, but from continual effort by many. Yet she also knew that sometimes one night of standing up at the right moment was enough to shake an entire system, and everything that followed proved that although the road to reform was long, it had begun with a step in the right direction. The afternoon fell over the city in a layer of pale gold stretching across the buildings, softening everything, quieting it after days of chaos. Marsha stood by the window of her apartment, her hand resting lightly on the wooden frame, her eyes following the flow of traffic below. She was not looking for anything specific, only letting her mind drift with the movement of the street. Tea is the way people often do when they are ready to close an important chapter of their lives. Many days had passed since the incident was resolved, since the meetings, the hearing, the flood of articles, and the changes steadily taking shape within the system. But only now, when the sounds outside had faded into a distant hum, did she finally have the space to look back at everything. She remembered the moment she nearly had handcuffs on her wrists for a crime that did not exist. The flashing red and blue lights sweeping across the pavement, Cole's threatening shout, the cold sharpness of metal near her wrist, the accusing eyes ready to condemn her, all surged back like a slow-motion reel. A small part of that memory made her pause, not out of fear, but because she understood clearly how close she stood to a razor-thin line. If she had reacted one breath too sharply, spoken one syllable too loudly, turned 1 degree too quickly, everything could have gone in another direction. She had seen it happen to others, had read reports, had heard teammates recount situations that should have been harmless, but ended in tragedy when tension spun out of control. Yet, when that image turned within her mind, Marsha did not see herself as the victim so many called her. She sat down in the chair by the window, hands clasped, lifting her chin slightly to receive the day's soft, fading light. "I just chose to stand on the side of truth," she whispered, as if reminding herself and affirming the very thing that had carried her through the hardest hours. She had not fought with loud resistance or anger, cause she knew heated emotion in that moment would only have worsened everything. She chose to confront it with intellect and steadiness, by holding her ground even as the truth was being twisted before her eyes. She did not deny the hurt, being insulted, being doubted, and being dismissed because of her skin color all left marks on any human being. But what kept Marsha from collapsing was her belief that justice, even when slow, can still find its path when someone is willing to stand up at the right moment. And this time, justice had been carried out properly. She did not need force to demand it, did not need to raise her voice to compel anyone. She held the posture of someone who knew her own worth and let the truth carve its own way forward. Satisfaction did not show on her face, but arrived as a lightness in her chest, like a breath finally returning to its proper rhythm after days of being constricted by pressure. She remembered the moment Grant delivered the final conclusion, the moment Reyes received his commendation, the day the mandatory training program went into effect, and the instant the city council nodded at her recommendations. Each piece connected in Marsha's mind, forming a clear picture of a justice process that was not perfect, could be slow, and at times painful, but was was a process she believed in. She leaned her head back, closing her eyes for a few seconds to fully feel the peace she had not allowed herself for weeks. In that moment, she realized that the calm returning to her heart was not because Cole and Hayes had been judged, not because the system was changing, nor because of public acknowledgement. It came from the fact that she had done the right thing. She had preserved her integrity even when pushed into the darkest circumstances. She had looked directly at injustice and refused to let it make her lose her direction. Outside, the sky had begun to fade into a soft purple, street lights clicking on one by one as if the city were gently shifting into its evening rhythm. Marsha opened her eyes and looked at the scene with a faint smile touching the corner of her lips. It was not the smile of victory, but the smile of someone who had completed a long journey, enough for her heart to finally relax without collapsing under exhaustion. She stood and walked toward the small kitchen to pour herself a glass of water. Droplets slid down the inside of the clear glass like the quiet space she was giving herself. She knew life would bring her more challenges, and the truth was that justice would not always appear as cleanly as it had this time. But she also knew that this time she had proven something important. The strength of calm can shift an entire situation, and the truth, when held by someone willing to face it, will always find its way into the light. That evening, as the city lights cast a soft, ribbon-like glow across the wooden table, Marsha felt her heart settle in a peace she could no longer remember the last time she had felt. She needed no applause, no recognition, no one to speak her name. What she needed was quiet within her soul, and now it had returned whole and deeper than ever. That morning, sunlight spread across the road in soft, pale golden patches, gentle and clear like a thin dust of dawn still lingering in the air. Marsha drove slowly along the street where everything had begun, where the flash of red and blue lights had once shifted the course of an ordinary night. Her tires rolled over the long shadows of trees on the asphalt, each rhythmic thud like a steady heartbeat, signaling that she was finally at peace. There was no tightness in her chest now, no instinctive alertness clinging to her whenever she remembered. Instead, there was ease, steadiness, and a quiet new faith growing inside her. She cracked the window so the morning breeze could drift in, carrying the faint scent of greenery like a simple grace for someone who had just walked through a storm. On the same road where she once had to brace every breath to survive, her heart now beat with full freedom. And as her car passed the exact spot where Cole had once stood blocking her hood, Marsha did not stop and did not look back with pain. She simply drove on, naturally, as if she had restored that place to its ordinary meaning. Meanwhile, Cole and Hayes were facing the full consequences they once believed they could escape. The internal hearing had shifted into a criminal investigation, and both were now officially charged as IA recommended. Cole, the man who had shouted with arrogant certainty, "I have authority," now sat in a holding cell, reading page after page of charges detailing the planted evidence, the armed threats, and the manipulation of reports. His swagger was gone, along with the defiant fire in his eyes. In its place was the drained face of someone who realized the power he relied on had collapsed beneath him. He had once stood in the middle of a public road believing he was untouchable. Yet, in the end, the very legal process he once dismissed was what brought him into the courtroom. Hayes also faced consequences, though the road ahead of him was not as dark as Cole's. His truthful testimony earned him leniency, but it did not erase his responsibility for that night. He lost his badge, his position, and the reputation he had tried to preserve by choosing silence instead of doing the right thing. Now, Hayes lived in days mixed with remorse and the desire to make amends. People looked at him with eyes caught between pity and disappointment. Even so, he understood that the most important thing was that he was paying his due, and paying it through a process far more transparent than the shortcuts he once thought could protect him. Those two men represented two different forms of collapse, one shattered by a misguided belief in his own power, the other unraveling because he was too afraid to resist wrongdoing. But in the end, justice favors no one, and they both arrived at the same point: accountability. At IA, Grant and Reyes continued their work, but whenever Marsha's case was mentioned, both gave her a level of respect they rarely extended to civilians. Grant, with his usual seriousness, once said in a meeting that without Marsha's composure, if she had reacted on instinct or anger, the incident could have ended very differently, wrongly, or then tragically. He kept his thanks to her as a bridge between professional duty and genuine respect. To Grant, Marsha was not just a victim, but an ally of justice, someone who understood the true cost of truth and did not hesitate to pay it. Reyes, who had stood at the scene during its most tense moment, never forgot how Marsha held herself between two officers abusing their authority. He had seen many similar situations throughout his career, but very few people remained calm enough not to be provoked. To him, Marsha's journey proved that strength does not lie in fierce resistance, but in holding one's integrity under crushing pressure. In later meetings, whenever procedural reform was discussed, Reyes often brought up that moment as an example of what the profession must protect. Marsha did not seek praise. She smiled when she heard such words, but did not keep them in her heart as trophies. To her, all of it was simply the natural outcome of choosing to stand firm in the truth. Yet, the respect Grant and Reyes gave her was not the simple acknowledgement of colleagues or people within the system. It was the recognition of those who understood better than anyone how fragile justice can be, and who knew that sometimes one person standing at the right moment is enough to keep an entire system from sliding further. That afternoon, when Marsha parked beside a small cafe and stepped onto the sidewalk, she paused for a moment to watch the flow of passers-by. Each face carried its own story, small joys, heavy worries, journeys no one else knew. She suddenly realized that justice was not something lofty and separate from everyday life. It existed in every moment, every word, every glance people gave each other. It lived in the choice to treat others with respect, and in small acts that often went unnoticed. But justice could not survive on its own without people willing to protect it. She sat at an outdoor table, watching the thin steam rise from her cup of coffee, her heart light as still water. What she had endured, the insults, the pounding on her car door, the flashing patrol lights, the moment a gun was raised at her, no longer held her in darkness. All of it had become part of the process she understood was necessary to change something larger than herself. Sometimes she wondered whether she could have done anything differently, whether she could have chosen to stay silent, avoid trouble, or try to appease the abuser's emotions just to escape the situation faster. But that thought always stopped at the same answer. The truth does not change just because people want it to, and if she had not stood firm, the truth would have been twisted in exactly the way someone like Cole hoped for. As the sun began to set, casting bright orange streaks across the streets, Marsha rose, took a deep breath, and walked forward with steps that were light yet unwavering. She did not look back at the road behind her, did not carry any lingering weight, but moved ahead like someone ready for the new pages of her life. Those pages might hold challenges, might hold injustice, but she knew she could face all of it with the same calm resolve that had carried her through the worst night she had ever endured. Marsha's story closed not with applause or celebration, but with the message she carried each time she moved forward. Justice arrives when someone dares to stand firm in the truth. Not the strongest people, not the loudest, but those who do not lose themselves in the moment. They must choose between fear and truth. And when someone dares to choose truth, justice will find its way to them, no matter how long the path may be. Marsha kept walking in the warm evening light and with the ease of spirit she deserved, carrying with her the belief that one person who stands steady can change the world in ways they never expect. As the story ends and the upheaval settles, details, Marsha's journey appears as a deeply layered portrait of steadfastness in the face of injustice and the power of truth. A quiet night on an empty road unfolded into a chain of events that forced her to confront officers who abused their authority, men who used prejudiced eyes and wrongful actions to impose a crime she had never committed. From the moment she was stopped, judged through bias, tested by escalating violence and blatant manipulation, Marsha held on to her calm and her clarity so she would not endanger herself. And it was exactly that steadfastness that opened the door to justice. What began as a minor encounter, twisted by Cole and Hayes's scheme, grew beyond the scope of a routine stop. Their condescending insults, baseless search, and escalating force brought Marsha dangerously close to harm. When the planted evidence appeared in her trunk, she understood the truth was being distorted. But instead of reacting with anger, she chose to use her knowledge of the law and her rights to turn the situation, allowing IA to intervene at the right moment. Grant and Reyes emerged as pillars of transparency, representatives of the legal system that still operated as it should. They took Marsha's statement, reviewed every detail, and cross-checked it with the forensic findings to illuminate the truth. Those investigative steps not only exposed the planted evidence but also delivered a firm conclusion about the responsibility of each person involved. Cole's collapse began the moment his fingerprints were confirmed on the evidence, while Hayes admitted wrongdoing because he could no longer endure the pressure of the truth being uncovered. The strict disciplinary process removed both of them from the force and opened the door to broader reform for the entire department. From that point, the impact spread powerfully through the community. Public outrage surged, and people came forward with experiences long ignored. The police department was forced to re-examine every procedure, revise its approach, retrain its officers, and demand greater transparency in every action. Reyes was commended for his integrity, while Marsha became a figure widely respected. But what made the story even more profound was the way Marsha continued to act with humility and calm. She did not see herself as a victor, but as someone given the opportunity to do the right thing. During the hearing before the city council, she shared her experience with a composure that made those listening reflect on their own responsibilities. Justice cannot depend on skin color, was the statement that struck at the root of the issue, making everyone understand that the injustice did not lie solely in one incident, but in the way the system operated. Her words were not just a reflection of a turbulent night, but an opening for the reforms that needed to follow. As the new procedures were implemented, as the anti-bias training sessions took shape, as officers began to change the way they viewed and carried out their duties, Marsha stepped back and allowed those changes to grow in the direction society had been waiting for. She chose to continue living with her newfound peace, continuing her mission without abandoning the steadfast spirit that had carried her through the night she confronted abuse of power. Her life did not return to what it had been before, but became better in ways she had never expected. From Marsha's journey come lessons that anyone can carry with them. First, the truth is the strongest anchor in any situation, especially when it is tested. No matter how powerful someone may be, the truth always finds a way to rise, especially when there is someone willing to face it with calm and resolve. Second, justice cannot find its path unless people speak up. It needs individuals like Marsha, like Reyes, like Grant, those willing to stand in difficult positions to choose what is right. The third lesson is the power of calm, a soft kind of strength that can overcome aggression and abuse of authority. Marsha did not prevail through shouting or impulsive resistance. She prevailed through reason, through her ability to hold herself steady in a situation that seemed to push her into a dark corner. And the final lesson is belief in change. Even when a system has many flaws, there's always room for improvement when enough people strive for it. The story ends with the image of Marsha driving down the same old road with a light heart. But what lingers is not what she endured, but how she moved through it. A story about justice, about courage, about truth, and about the ability to transform a system from moments that seem the smallest. And for anyone watching, the final message remains clear. Justice comes when someone chooses to stand firm with the truth.